The science of that, though, is what we were talking about when we were talking about the fireworms. Because the fireworms, this was something that people called them, where it appeared as though there were little, worms of fire flying in the air. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's the names I use in the book are the names of phenomena that children often came up with for these things. And after the bomb in Hiroshima, there were these 5, 6, up to 10-story tall tornadoes of fire. To children, they looked like giant worms. And they felt as if these things were almost living creatures. There's, as one of the survivors was describing it, it seemed to her like a scene out of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, where the Martian tripods stopped at one point at a river, and they were looking around as if deciding what to do before they crossed, and then they all crossed at once, and that's what she saw these fireworms do, except that the fireworms, when they came across the water, they started pulling up water, and they became water spouts for a while, strong enough when they hit the opposite shore to just pelt people with pebbles and rip their clothes to shreds right off their body, and then they would continue inland where other fires were burning and draw up flames and become 6-story tall fireworms again.
And the fireworms were just one of the hazards. The grass people, that was another children's term for what had happened?
The grass boys, actually, that was a term that was used by Somo Yamaguchi, who survived within the Ground Zero zone, and he had military training. He was a ship designer and weapons designer and partly a spy, also translating American plans that had been captured for designs of weaponry from English into Japanese. And he, from his military training, he saw the flash, and his first thought was a bomb, an incendiary bomb, is flashing right before my eyes. It's maybe 10 feet away. I'm dead. And he dove immediately into a pit. He must have made that dive into a water-filled trench near a potato farm that he was walking past. He must have made that whole motion in less than 1/3 of a second. And yet still he was burned on one side of his body. His white clothing protected him to some degree, but was mostly stripped from his body. His hair was burned off. His hair had also managed to protect one side of his face somewhat. His one hand was practically degloved by the explosion and the fire. People standing around him who had been, one woman who had been dressed in black clothing, work clothing, and had been standing nearby, basically disappeared. He couldn't see her again. He was close enough to almost actually be drawn into that huge shock bubble as it collapsed into a fireball and started rising. He was actually pulled out of the pit, and he said levitated in the air for a long time, where it seemed that the bomb was deciding whether to drop him or to pull him all the way up into the sky, and it dropped him into another mud pool instead.
And he's the one who sees these grass boys, these boys who are hit by flying blades of grass.
Grass was embedded in their bodies like little darts.
Like little darts. Well, that brings us to the ant people, and then inevitably to the last train from Hiroshima. We're talking with Charles Pellegrino, who brings a scientist's eye to the events of August 6th, 1945. So, after the bombing of Hiroshima, Charles Pellegrino writes that the population kind of turned into the ant people. That was a term used by whom, Charles?
It was used by children. It was also used by Dr. Haichiya, who I found out totally by accident. In fact, I found his diary totally by accident. I was in a bookstore in Philadelphia on vacation, went into a used bookstore and saw in the science fiction section where I was looking, spying out Hiroshima Diary. Book's been out of print for decades and decades, and it was by this Dr. Haichiya. And as I'm reading that, I'm coming across the story of Mr. Sasaki, and then when if you know the story of Sadako Sasaki and the 1,000 Paper Cranes, he was their next-door neighbor. There's a whole tragic story involved in that where he became one of the ant walkers, these people who would follow each other over broken bits of building and just one person following the other over rugged trails where right nearby was an intact sidewalk and a road. They were just following blindly in shock, one behind the other.
And not blind.
Right.
But just following blindly in that sense that one person was going, so they're going to follow even though there was a clear, smooth path right next to them.
Right.
Let me back you up, though, a little bit. So you mentioned blindly following. There were people, oddly enough, and we don't really have an explanation for this, who had been cured of a need for glasses after the bomb went off at Hiroshima. And not just one, but at least two.
At least
right?
two. One of them was a doctor who, when I met him in the United States when I was in college, and he had described how half the hospital disappeared around him up to about his waist. And he stood up, and the building was gone. The other doctors were gone. The patients were gone. And he couldn't see anything. The dust was starting to clear. He couldn't see anything. His glasses had been knocked off his face. And then he found his one completely intact little music box, delicate thing. I think it was porcelain, without a chip off of it, and it still played. I think the song was "Let Me Call You Sweetheart."
Right.
And then he found his glasses, and the smoke was clearing by then, and he realized that, oh, I can see. And when he put his glasses on, he couldn't see anything. And then he took his glasses off, and he realized, oh, I'm seeing all the points and angles on this, all the delicate work on this music box. And he told me years later that in the understatement that the Japanese people often do use, he said, but of course I would not recommend nuclear detonations for corrective eye surgery.
No. And the other person, same thing, but they had the same effect as somehow the blast corrected their vision problems.
Right,
the other guy,
he walked away from a military storehouse where he was the only survivor at the military base. And he ended up walking, I think, deeper into Ground Zero toward one of the main bridges, and there he came across a horse that started following him, and the horse had been completely degloved. If you've seen the movie Terminator 2, where Arnold Schwarzenegger pulls all the skin off of his hand, his robotic hand, that's what happened to that horse.
Yeah, and the horse was completely without any skin anywhere on its body.
Right, and it was this pinkish horse that was following him and kind of haunting him for a while, and he was a Christian, and he recalled the passage from the book, The Revelation of John, where, and I beheld, I was
a pale horse.
Yeah, the vial was opened, and look, and I beheld the pale horse, and the name of he that was on it was Death, and hell came with him. And he said that horse haunted him for the rest of his life.
I could totally understand that. Well,
to about 300 people traveled from Hiroshima to Nagasaki on these last two functioning trains that they sent out of Hiroshima. And most of them were weapons workers and the guys who had been working on making kites that could do all sorts of reconnaissance. Three of them survived both bombings. And most of them were people who worked for Mitsubishi. And they traveled through the night, seeing fire bombings of other towns on either side of the train, because those continued all the way through August 9th, through a temporary moratorium after Nagasaki to allow for a surrender, which didn't come.
Right.
But they were mostly Mitsubishi engineers who had a priority to be evacuated from Hiroshima to the Mitsubishi plants in Nagasaki. About 300 people made that trip, and we know of about 30 who survived the second bombing. So roughly 90% of them were killed in the second bombing.
So here they survive Hiroshima, fight their way to get onto the last train that takes them to Nagasaki, where how long had they been in Nagasaki when the second bomb came?
Some of them were literally riding into Nagasaki as the second bomb detonated.
And so we just even